The sky over Mars burned crimson as Krathar warships descended, their plasma cannons tearing through the fragile domes of New Athens. The colony's distress signals screamed across the void, a cacophony of static and terror before silence fell. On Earth, the news hit like a shockwave. 12,000 dead, humanity's foothold beyond the homeworld reduced to ash. The Krathar Empire, a juggernaut of steel and conquest, had issued their ultimatum days before: kneel or perish. Humanity, dismissed as a backwater species, had refused. Now the galaxy watched to see if Earth's defiance was bravery or folly. Admiral Elena Cortez stood in the war room of the United Earth Defense Force, her eyes locked on the flickering holo display. The footage from Mars looped endlessly, alien ships carving through the sky, civilians fleeing, and the final blinding flash as the colony's reactor went critical. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms. Her sister had been there, tending hydroponic farms, her laughter now buried under rubble. Cortez's grief was a blade sharp and cold, but she buried it deep. Earth needed a leader, not a mourner. The room buzzed with tension. Generals from fractured nations argued over surrender, their voices rising like a storm. "We can't fight them," General Zhao snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "Their ships outnumber ours 10-1. They've crushed species older than us." Cortez's gaze snapped to him, her voice low and venomous. "And if we kneel, what then? Slaves? Experiments? I'd rather die fighting than live on their leash." Her words silenced the room, but the doubt lingered, thick as smoke. Humanity was a fractured mess. Centuries of wars, distrust, and greed had left them weak. The Krathar knew this, their arrogance dripping from every transmission. Primitive apes. Their commander, Krell-Tar, had sneered in his broadcast, his reptilian eyes glinting with disdain. "Your world will be a footnote in our archives." Cortez memorized his face, his voice, the way his mandibles clicked with smug certainty. She'd make him choke on those words. Across the galaxy, another watched. Zainara, a Valyrian spy embedded in the Krathar fleet, leaned closer to her console, her bioluminescent skin pulsing faintly in the dim light. The Valyrians, masters of subterfuge, thrived on chaos, and Earth's defiance intrigued her. The Krathar saw humans as vermin, but Zainara sensed something else, a spark, unpredictable and dangerous. She tapped a claw against her communicator, debating whether to report this to her superiors. If humanity survived, they could be pawns, or threats. Back on Earth, Cortez moved with purpose, her boots echoing through the UEDF's underground bunker. The plan was reckless, desperate, but it was all they had. The Krathar had underestimated humanity's ingenuity, their knack for turning scraps into weapons. Salvaged alien tech from crashed probes had been reverse-engineered, bolted onto outdated ships. The result was a fleet of misfits, clunky, untested, but unpredictable. Cortez's strategy hinged on that chaos. The target was a Krathar supply depot in the asteroid belt, a choke point for their invasion. Hit it hard, disrupt their logistics, and buy Earth time. The generals had balked, but Cortez's fire had swayed them. Now as she boarded her flagship, the Defiant, she felt the weight of their hope and their fear. Her crew, a mix of veterans and raw recruits, watched her with wide eyes. "We're not just fighting for Earth," she told them, her voice steady. "We're fighting for every soul they've crushed. Let's make them bleed." The Defiant launched, its engines roaring, a defiant scream against the void. In the shadows of the Krathar fleet, Zainara watched, her curiosity deepening. Krell-Tar, aboard his dreadnought, dismissed the human ships as a nuisance. "Let them come," he growled, his claws tightening on his throne. "I'll crush their hope myself." But Cortez had a surprise waiting. Humanity wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove something. And in the asteroid belt, under a sky of spinning rocks and silent stars, the first clash would ignite a war that would echo across the galaxy. The asteroid belt was a graveyard of jagged rock and frozen dust, a labyrinth of shadows where light bent and sensors faltered. The Defiant and its ragtag fleet slipped through the chaos, their hulls patched with salvaged Krathar plating that flickered with jury-rigged stealth tech. Admiral Elena Cortez stood on the bridge, her eyes locked on the tactical display. The Krathar supply depot loomed ahead, a hulking fortress of steel and plasma conduits its defenses bristling with turrets. It was a suicide run by any sane measure, but sanity had died on Mars. Cortez's plan was simple in theory, insane in practice. Hit the depot, draw the Krathar battle group into a trap, and bleed them dry. The raid was a feint, a lure to exploit their arrogance. She'd studied Kreltar's tactics, rigid, predictable, built on overwhelming force. He'd chase them, eager to crush what he saw as vermin. And when he did, the asteroids would become humanity's ally. "Engines to quarter thrust," Cortez ordered, her voice calm despite the sweat beading on her brow. "Stay dark. Let them think we're scavengers." Her crew obeyed, their faces pale but resolute. The Defiant's pilot, Lieutenant Hayes, muttered a prayer under his breath, his hands trembling on the controls. Cortez caught his eye, nodding once. "We've got this," she said, and he straightened, feeding on her conviction. In the Krathar flagship Iron Fang, Kreltar watched the sensor blips with disdain. "Humans," he growled, his mandibles clicking, "scuttling like rats. Crush them." His lieutenants nodded, their claws tapping commands. The battle group surged forward, a swarm of sleek warships bristling with firepower. Kreltar's arrogance blinded him to the trap, but Zainara, hidden in the shadows of his bridge, saw it. The humans moved too precisely, too confidently. She tapped her communicator, risking detection to warn her Valyrian handlers. "They're not fleeing," she whispered. "They're baiting." The first strike came like a thunderclap. Human ships erupted from the asteroid shadows, their salvage plasma cannons spitting fire. The depot's shields flared, then buckled under a barrage of kinetic rounds. Scrap metal accelerated to lethal speeds by Earth's makeshift railguns. The Krathar roared in fury, their ships pivoting to pursue, but the humans vanished into the rocks, their stealth tech scattering sensor readings. "Find them!" Kreltar bellowed, his tail lashing. But the asteroids were a maze, and humanity knew how to hide. Cortez's voice crackled over the fleet's comms. "Now!" The trap sprang. Mines, cobbled from asteroid ore and stolen Krathar explosives, detonated in synchronized waves, shredding the lead ships. Debris spun wildly, clogging sensors and shields. The Defiant led the counterattack, weaving through the chaos with reckless precision. Hayes pushed the ship to its limits, dodging plasma bolts that lit the void like fireworks. "They're panicking," he shouted, grinning despite the sweat on his face. Cortez didn't smile. "Not yet. Keep them chasing." The Krathar faltered, their formation fracturing under the onslaught. Kreltar's rage boiled over, his claws slashing at his console. "They dare mock us?" he roared. But doubt crept in, a whisper he couldn't silence. These humans fought like cornered beasts, unpredictable and vicious. Zainara watched, her bioluminescent skin pulsing faster. The humans weren't just surviving, they were winning. The Defiant took a hit, its hull screaming as plasma breached the starboard plating. Alarms blared and Cortez staggered, blood trickling from a gash on her temple. "Divert power to thrusters," she snapped. "We're not done." Half her fleet was gone, their signals winking out like dying stars, but the Krathar were bleeding worse. The depot burned, its wreckage scattering across the belt. Cortez's trap had worked, but the cost gnawed at her. She'd traded lives for time, and the weight of it settled like ash. Kreltar's flagship limped away, its hull scarred. "This isn't over," he vowed, his voice a venomous hiss. Zanara's report to the Valyrians was brief. The humans adapt, they learn, they win. Cortez aboard the battered Defiant stared at the stars, her grief and resolve warring within her. The galaxy would fear Earth now, but fear bred desperation, and desperation bred war. The war room in UEDF headquarters was a tomb of concrete and flickering lights buried deep beneath the Rockies. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to skin and soured breath. Admiral Elena Cortez stood at the head of the table, her uniform crisp but her eyes shadowed. The victory in the asteroid belt had bought Earth time, but the cost was etched in the faces around her. Generals, politicians, survivors. Mars still burned in their minds, and the Krathar's shadow loomed larger than ever. But now, the enemy wasn't just beyond the stars, it was here, in this room. General Zhao paced, his voice sharp as a blade. "We can't sustain this, Cortez. The fleet's in tatters, and the Krathar will regroup. Surrender buys us time. Maybe mercy." His words drew murmurs of agreement from the European bloc, their faces pale with fear. Cortez's gaze snapped to him, cold and unyielding. Mercy? From them? They glassed Mars, Zhao. You think they'll spare us because we beg? Her voice cut through the room, silencing the murmurs, but doubt lingered like smoke. She knew the truth. Humanity was fracturing. The UEDF was a fragile alliance, stitched together by desperation. Old rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and fear was tearing the seams. That fear exploded hours later when Luna fell. Crathar strike craft, guided by precise intel, shredded the lunar defenses, leaving craters where bunkers once stood. Cortez watched the footage, her hands trembling. The attack was too perfect, too surgical. Someone had betrayed them. The traitor was General Marlowe, a wiry man with a politician's smile. Cortez cornered him in a maintenance tunnel, her sidearm pressed to his temple. Why? She hissed, her voice raw. Marlowe's defiance crumbled, his words spilling like blood. The Valyrians promised protection. Earth can't win, Cortez. You're leading us to extinction. His confession unraveled a web of deceit. Valyrian agents whispering in the shadows, exploiting humanity's divisions. Cortez's finger tightened on the trigger, but she stopped. Killing him privately wouldn't unify Earth. She needed a spectacle. The execution was public, broadcast across every screen on Earth. Marlowe knelt in the UEDF courtyard, his hands bound, his eyes wide with terror. Cortez stood before him, her voice steady as she read the charges. You sold us out. You killed Luna. The crowd, soldiers, civilians, leaders, watched in silence. She raised her pistol and the shot echoed like thunder. Blood pooled on the concrete and Cortez met their gazes, unflinching. This is what betrayal costs, she said. We fight or we die. Choose. The room shifted after that. Fear turned to resolve, but Cortez felt the weight of her ruthlessness settle on her shoulders. She'd unified them, but at what cost? Alone in her quarters, she stared at the holomap, tracing the Valyrian systems. They'd played Earth like a pawn, stoking chaos to weaken both humans and Crathar. Zainara, aboard the Crathar flagship, watched the execution feed, her bioluminescent skin dimming. She'd underestimated Cortez's resolve, and now she feared it. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival, they were learning to play the game. Cortez's next move was reckless, a gamble to expose the Valyrians. She leaked false intel through Marlowe's channels, claiming Earth was planning a desperate strike on a Crathar stronghold. The Valyrians, eager to watch their rivals bleed, would take the bait, and the Crathar would follow. Cortez's plan was to lure both fleets into a trap, turning their distrust into chaos. But the stakes were higher now. If she failed, Earth would fall. As the Defiant prepared to launch, Cortez caught her reflection in the viewport. Bloodshot eyes, a face hardened by loss. She thought of Mars, of her sister's laughter, of Marlowe's betrayal. Humanity was fractured, but so were their enemies. The Valyrians thought they controlled the board, but Cortez would burn it down. Set course, she ordered, her voice steel. We're not just fighting a war, we're rewriting the rules. In the silence of space, Zainara sent a message to her handlers. The humans are dangerous, do not underestimate them. The galaxy watched, waiting for Earth's next move. And Cortez, haunted but unyielding, led her fleet into the void, ready to turn betrayal into victory. The gas giant loomed like a bruised god, its rings shattered into jagged moons that spun in chaotic orbits. The neutral system was a graveyard of ancient battles, its debris fields a perfect stage for chaos. Admiral Elena Cortez stood on the Defiance bridge, her eyes locked on the holo display. The Crathar and Valyrian fleets were closing in, lured by her gambit, a hacked comm signal claiming Earth was launching a desperate assault. They'd taken the bait, eager to crush each other and humanity in one blow. Cortez's plan was simple. Let them bleed, then strike. The Defiant and its battered fleet hid among the broken moons, their salvaged stealth tech scattering sensor readings. Cortez's voice was steady as she issued orders. Hold position. Let them see each other first. Her crew obeyed, their faces tight with fear and resolve. Lieutenant Hayes, his hands steady on the controls, muttered, "This is insane, Admiral." Cortez's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Insane's all we've got." In the Crathar flagship Iron Fang, Kreltar's mandibles clicked with fury. The Valyrians dare trespass here? He growled, his claws slashing at his console. His sensors screamed warnings, Valyrian ships emerging from the gas giant's shadow. He didn't see the humans, didn't care. The Valyrians were a threat, and his pride demanded blood. "Engage!" he roared, and his fleet surged forward, plasma cannons blazing. Zainara, aboard a Valyrian stealth frigate, watched the Crathar charge. Her bioluminescent skin pulsed with unease. The humans were here. She felt it, a shadow on the edge of her senses. She tapped her communicator, warning her commander, "It's a trap. The humans planned this." But her words came too late. The Valyrians opened fire, their particle beams slicing through the void. The battle erupted, a storm of fire and debris. Cortez watched the chaos unfold, her heart pounding. The fleets clashed, their formations fracturing under mutual distrust. Crathar dreadnoughts traded salvos with Valyrian frigates, their shields flaring like dying stars. Debris spun wildly, smashing into ships and moons alike. "Now," Cortez said, her voice cold. The Defiant and its fleet surged from hiding, weaving through the wreckage with reckless precision. Their salvaged weapons spat fire, targeting weak points exposed by the enemy's focus on each other. The Crathar and Valyrians faltered, caught off guard. Kreltar's rage boiled over as human ships darted through his lines, their tactics unpredictable. "Where are they?" he bellowed, his sensors scrambled by the debris. Zanara's frigate took a hit, its hull breached. She staggered, blood trickling from her temple, but her mind raced. The humans weren't just fighting. They were exploiting every mistake, every flaw. She admired it, even as it terrified her. The Defiant led the charge, Hayes pushing the ship to its limits. Plasma bolts grazed their hull, alarms screaming, but Cortez stood unflinching. "Target their command links," she ordered. Human missiles, cobbled from asteroid ore and stolen tech, struck with surgical precision, crippling comms. The Crathar and Valyrians, already distrustful, descended into chaos, their fleets scattering. Cortez's gamble was working, but the cost was rising. Half her ships were gone, their signals winking out like dying stars. Kreltar's flagship limped, its hull scarred. "Retreat," he roared, his pride shattered. The Valyrians followed, their losses catastrophic. Zanara's frigate escaped, her report to her superiors brief. "The humans turned us against each other. They're rewriting war." Cortez watched the enemy flee, her chest tight. The battle was won, but the Defiant was battered, its crew exhausted. She interrogated a captured Crathar officer, his words chilling. "We fear you. The Arctians warned of your kind, adaptable destroyers from a blue world." Cortez stared at the stars, haunted by the revelation. The galaxy wasn't just fighting to crush Earth, it was fighting to survive it. She'd won today, but the war was far from over. And somewhere, in the shadows of broken moons, the truth of humanity's destiny waited. The planet hung in the void like a forgotten relic, its surface scarred by eons of silence. Jagged ruins pierced the dust-choked sky, remnants of the Arctians, a civilization long dead but whispering through time. Admiral Elena Cortez stood in the Defiant's hangar, her boots echoing on the deck as she briefed her team. The captured Crathar officer's words echoed in her mind. "The Arctians warned of you, adaptable destroyers from a blue world." She needed answers, and this desolate world held them. The mission was covert, a gamble against time. The Crathar would track them, and the Valyrians were watching. Cortez's squad was small. Lieutenant Hayes, her pilot, Dr. Lin, a linguist fluent in alien scripts, and Sergeant Vega, a grizzled Marine with scars older than his years. They boarded the shuttle, its hull patched with salvaged plating. "Stay sharp," Cortez said, her voice low. "We're not alone here." Hayes nodded, his hands steady on the controls, but Vega's grip on his rifle tightened. The descent was brutal, the atmosphere clawing at the shuttle with shrieking winds. They landed in a crater, the ruins rising like skeletal fingers. The air was thin, laced with dust that stung their eyes. Dr. Lin's scanner hummed, picking up faint energy signatures. "This way," she said, pointing to a towering structure etched with glyphs. Cortez felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the weight of the place. It felt alive, watching. They moved through shadowed halls, their lights flickering off walls, carved with scenes of war and prophecy. The glyphs spoke of the Arctians' fall, their fear of a species that, Learned too fast, burned too bright. Dr. Lin's voice trembled as she translated. They saw us, Admiral, millennia ago. They knew we'd come. Cortez's jaw tightened. Knew what? That we'd fight? Survive? Lin shook her head. That we'd destroy. The chamber at the heart of the ruins was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. A crystalline console glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Lin touched it, and the room flared to life, hollow projections blooming around them. Maps of the galaxy spun, marking hidden caches of Arctian weapons, tech that could turn the tide. But the projections shifted, showing Earth, its skies burning, its cities ash. A warning, Lin whispered, or a choice. Cortez stared, haunted by the images. Were they saviors or destroyers? The Krathar feared them, the Valyrians manipulated them, but the Arctians had seen something deeper. She pushed the thought aside. Download the map, she ordered. We need those weapons. But the console flared, its energy spiking. Vega's voice crackled over comms. Contact! Krathar inbound! The ruins trembled, dust raining from the ceiling. Zanara's stealth frigate had tracked them, her curiosity outweighing caution. She landed in the shadows, her bioluminescent skin dimming as she followed their trail. She saw the projections, heard Lin's translations, and felt a chill. The humans were unlocking secrets the galaxy had buried for a reason. She tapped her communicator, debating whether to warn her superiors or help Cortez. The choice was made for her when Krathar drop pods slammed into the ruins. The skirmish was brutal, confined chaos in the tight corridors. Vega's rifle barked, shredding Krathar armor, but their numbers pressed in. Hayes dragged Lin back, her hands clutching the downloaded map. Cortez fought with cold precision, her pistol spitting fire, but a Krathar blade grazed her arm, blood soaking her sleeve. Zanara appeared, her particle gun blazing, cutting down the attackers. We need to leave, she hissed, her eyes meeting Cortez's. Now. They fled, the ruins collapsing behind them. The shuttle barely escaping as Krathar ships rained fire. Zanara sat in silence, her allegiance shifting. Cortez stared at her, wary but grateful. Why help us? She asked. Zanara's voice was low. Because you're not what they fear. You're worse. The map glowed on the console, a promise and a threat. Cortez knew the war had changed. The galaxy wasn't just fighting Earth, it was fighting its future. And she'd make sure humanity chose its own path, even if it burned. The galaxy trembled under the weight of Earth's defiance. Armed with the Arctian map, Admiral Elena Cortez turned humanity's desperation into a blade. The Defiant and its battered fleet became shadows, striking Krathar and Valyrian targets with surgical precision. The first cache yielded EMP mines, relics of Arctian ingenuity that crippled entire squadrons. Cortez's tactics evolved, feints within feints, psychological warfare that fractured enemy morale. The Krathar called her the Ghost of Terra, a name whispered in fear. The war room aboard the Defiant buzzed with tension. Cortez stood before the holomap, its glowing lines marking their next targets. Lieutenant Hayes plotted courses, his hands steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Dr. Lin deciphered Arctian codes, her voice tight with urgency. The next cache is in Sirius, she said. Heavy weapons. If we secure it, we can end this. Cortez nodded, but her gaze lingered on the map's edges, where Valyrian fleets massed. They'd allied with the Krathar, a fragile pact born of desperation. Earth's rise threatened them both. The Battle of Sirius was a crucible. Cortez's fleet arrived under stealth, the EMP mines deployed in a silent web. The Krathar flagship Iron Fang led the charge, Kreltar's voice booming over open comms. Surrender, human. Your tricks end here. Cortez's reply was cold. You've already lost. The mines detonated, a cascade of blue fire that fried their shields. Human ships surged from hiding, their salvaged cannons blazing. The Valyrians, caught in the crossfire, faltered, their formations crumbling under Cortez's relentless assault. Zanara, aboard a Valyrian frigate, watched the chaos unfold. She'd defected to Earth, risking execution, but doubt gnawed at her. Humanity's ruthlessness mirrored the Arctians' warnings. She fought alongside them, her particle gun cutting through Krathar drones, but her eyes stayed on Cortez. The Admiral's orders were precise, brutal. Ships sacrificed as bait, enemy crews left to drift in the void. Zainara whispered to herself, "What have I joined?" The Defiant took hits, its hull screaming under plasma fire. Hayes pushed the engines to their limits, weaving through debris. "Shields at 10%, he shouted. Cortez stood unflinching, her voice steel. "Focus fire on the Iron Fang." The EMP surge had left it vulnerable, and human missiles struck true, breaching its core. Krell-Tar's roar of fury cut off as the flagship erupted, a dying star in the void. The Krothar fleet scattered, their morale shattered. But victory came at a cost. Half the human fleet was gone, their signals winking out like fading embers. Cortez's hands trembled as she reviewed the losses, names scrolling across her screen. Vega's squad, lost in a boarding action. Lynn's shuttle, vaporized by a stray plasma bolt. Hayes met her gaze, his voice low. "We won, Admiral, but how much more can we lose?" Cortez didn't answer, her eyes haunted. She'd unified Earth, but the weight of command was crushing her. Xionara approached, her bioluminescent skin dim. "The Valyrians are retreating," she said. "But they're desperate. They'll use the planet killer." Cortez's blood ran cold. The weapon, a relic of Valyrian paranoia, could turn Earth to ash. "Where?" she demanded. Xionara hesitated, then pointed to a holomap. "Their homeworld. It's their last stand." Cortez stared at the coordinates, her resolve hardening. "Then we end it there." The Defiant limped toward Valyrian space, its crew exhausted but defiant. Cortez stood alone on the bridge, staring at the stars. She thought of Mars, of Lynn's laughter, of Xionara's warning. "You're worse than they fear." Humanity was winning, but at what cost? The galaxy watched, holding its breath. Krell-Tar's surrender came hours later, his voice broken. "You've won, Ghost, but beware, you've woken the void." Cortez ignored the chill in his words. The war wasn't over. The Valyrians awaited, their doomsday weapon primed, and Earth, battered but unbowed, would face them. She'd make sure of it, even if it broke her. The stars burned, silent witnesses to humanity's rise and its shadow. The Valyrian homeworld hung in the void, its violet skies streaked with ash. The planet killer loomed in orbit, a monolith of cold steel and glowing conduits, its core pulsing with energy that could shatter Earth. Admiral Elena Cortez stood on the Defiant's bridge, her face a mask of resolve, but her hands clenched the console until her knuckles whitened. The fleet was a shadow of its former self, scarred hulls, exhausted crews, and dwindling hope. But surrender wasn't an option, not now. "Status," Cortez snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of alarms. Lieutenant Hayes, his face gaunt, reported, "Shields at 20%, weapons at half capacity. We've got one shot at this, Admiral." Xionara stood beside him, her bioluminescent skin dim, her eyes locked on the holodisplay. She'd risked everything to defect, but the weight of her choice hung heavy. "The weapon's shields are layered," she said. "I can disable them, but I need to get inside." Cortez met her gaze, seeing the resolve and the fear. "You're sure?" Xionara nodded. "It's the only way." The assault began with a desperate charge. The Defiant led the remnants of the fleet, weaving through Valyrian defenses. Particle beams sliced the void, tearing through human ships. The Vanguard exploded, its debris scattering like ash. Hayes pushed the Defiant to its limits, dodging fire, but the hull screamed under the strain. "We're taking hits," he shouted. Cortez's voice was steel. "Hold course, get us in range." The planet killer loomed closer, its glow a death knell. Xionara's shuttle launched, a speck against the chaos. She piloted it alone, her hands steady despite the sweat on her brow. Valyrian fighters swarmed, their beams grazing her hull. She gritted her teeth, weaving through the fire, her mind racing. She'd seen humanity's ruthlessness, its capacity for destruction, but she'd also seen its resolve. Its refusal to break. Cortez's voice crackled over comms. "Xionara, you're clear, go!" The shuttle dove, slipping past the outer defenses. Inside the weapon, Xionara moved fast, her particle gun blazing. Valyrian guards fell, their blood staining the sterile corridors. She reached the shield core, its glow blinding, and began hacking its controls. Alarms screamed, and footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, firing, but a beam grazed her side, pain searing through her. She staggered, blood pooling, but her fingers kept working. "Shields down," she gasped into her comm. "Cortez, finish it." The Earth lay scarred but unbowed, its skies streaked with the smoke of 1,000 battles. The war was over, but the silence felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Admiral Elena Cortez stood on a hill overlooking New Athens, the rebuilt Martian colony, its domes glinting under a crimson sky. Her uniform was gone, replaced by civilian clothes, but her eyes still carried the weight of command. She'd retired, passing the torch to younger leaders, but the galaxy's shadow loomed large. The Krathar had surrendered, the Valyrians were broken, but new factions rose in the chaos, hungry for power. In the UEDF's orbital command, Commander Aisha Patel studied Cortez's tactics, her fingers tracing hollow displays of past battles. She was young, sharp, and hungry to prove herself. The room buzzed with tension, reports of rogue Krathar warlords, Valyrian splinter cells, and whispers of Arkshan tech surfacing on the black market. "They're testing us," Patel said, her voice steady. "We need to strike first." Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Chen, nodded, his eyes on the map. "A Krathar fleet's massing near Proxima. If we hit them now, we set the tone." Cortez knew this, even from her quiet exile. Kreltar had warned her, his voice heavy with defeat. "You've woken the void, Ghost. It will test you." She'd dismissed it then, but now, as she watched the stars, she felt the truth. The galaxy feared Earth, and fear bred desperation. She visited Patel's command, her presence a spark in the room. "They'll come for us," Cortez said, her voice low. "Not with fleets, but with shadows. Stay sharp." The attack came without warning. Krathar stealth ships dropped from hyperspace, their plasma cannons tearing through Earth's outer defenses. Alarms screamed across the planet, cities plunging into lockdown. Patel's fleet scrambled, the Eclipse, a new flagship armed with Arkshan tech, leading the charge. "Engage," Patel ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. The battle was brutal. Ships weaving through debris, beams slicing the void. The Krathar fought with desperation, their warlord Trelvac roaring over comms, "You'll burn humans." Cortez watched from the surface, her hands clenched. The Eclipse took hits, its shields flaring, but Patel's tactics were Cortez's legacy: feints, ambushes, and unrelenting pressure. The Eclipse deployed EMP mines, crippling the Krathar flagship. Chen led a boarding party, his rifle blazing as they fought through its corridors. "For Earth," he shouted, cutting down Trelvac's guards. The warlord fell, his mandibles clicking in defiance, but his fleet scattered, their morale shattered. The victory was swift, but the cost lingered. Patel stood on the Eclipse's bridge, her face pale. "We lost 10 ships," she said, her voice tight, "but they'll think twice now." Cortez met her gaze, seeing the fire she'd once carried. "They'll come again," Cortez warned. "But you're ready. Humanity's ready." Patel nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll be the shield they can't break." In the shadows, Xenara's sacrifice echoed. Her death had bought Earth time, and Cortez honored it by mentoring the next generation. She walked the Martian fields, planting seeds in the soil her sister had loved. Kreltar, now an ally, visited, his scales dull with age. "You've changed the galaxy," he said, his voice heavy. "But it fears you still. The Arkshans saw it. Your light, your shadow." Cortez looked at him, unflinching. "We'll choose our path, and we'll fight for it." The galaxy watched, its factions scheming, but Earth stood tall. Patel's fleet patrolled the stars, Arkshan weapons gleaming on their hulls. New leaders rose, their eyes bright with defiance. Cortez stood on the hill, the wind carrying the sounds of rebuilding. The war was over, but the fight wasn't. Humanity had won, not just with ships and guns, but with its unrelenting spirit. The stars burned, silent witnesses to Earth's rise, and Cortez knew they'd shine brighter still.